I was the only person who showed up for my husband's funeral. A whole row of empty pews stretched out before me as I stood next to Jeremiah's mahogany casket. Our children, Kaylin with his wife and Anaya, had chosen cruises, trips, instead of giving a final farewell to the man who raised them. But before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far our stories travel. The funeral home director, a young man who looked like he just graduated, seemed more awkward than I was as he glanced at the vacant seats. It was a gray, typical October Monday in Atlanta, Georgia, when the sky couldn't decide whether to rain or just threaten. Jeremiah always hated indecision. "Mrs. Hampton, would you like to wait a few more minutes?" he asked, discreetly checking his watch. "We can start," I replied. My voice was firmer than I expected. Jeremiah hated delays. The pastor, a man who never knew my husband in life, began reciting generic words about a good man and cherished memories, while I fixed my eyes on the arrangement of white lilies atop the casket. Jeremiah would have preferred something simpler, maybe just the deep red roses from our backyard, the ones he faithfully pruned for 43 years. I sat alone in the front row. 5 empty chairs surrounding me screamed louder than any eulogy. Our 2 children, their spouses, our grandson Damani, not one of them present. Kaylin had sent a text message the night before. "Sorry, Mom. Big meeting in Miami. Can't reschedule. I'll call you next week." No further explanations. No attempt to shift his schedule to say goodbye to his own father. I pictured him sitting in some expensive conference room, occasionally checking the time, vaguely thinking about the funeral happening 1,000 miles away. Anaya was worse. She didn't even send a text. Her assistant called to say Anaya was indisposed and couldn't travel. Indisposed? As if we were talking about Sunday dinner, not the final goodbye to the man who carried her on his shoulders throughout her childhood. When the brief service ended, I followed the casket to the graveyard. The cold wind beat at my face, but I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't grieving, but because I'd cried so much over the last few weeks that I seemed to be fresh out of tears. The casket settled into the earth, and I tossed a handful of dirt onto it. The dirt hit the wood with a hollow sound, like the echo of my footsteps in the now empty house. I returned home, the same house where we raised our kids, where Jeremiah and I built a life for almost 5 decades. His house slippers were still next to his recliner. The TV remote was positioned exactly where he'd left it. The silence was deafening. I poured myself a glass of the good bourbon we saved for special occasions. This wasn't special, but it felt appropriate. I picked up my phone, and driven by an impulse I couldn't control, I opened Instagram. Anaya's profile was first on my feed. She had posted 3 hours earlier, exactly when her father's funeral was taking place. It was a photo on a yacht, champagne glasses raised high, a radiant smile. The caption read, "Living my best life." I swallowed hard. My daughter wasn't indisposed. She was on a yacht celebrating while I buried her father. I kept scrolling. Kaylin had also posted a selfie in a conference room with a caption about closing major deals and making worthwhile connections. No mention of his father. Not a word about grief. As if this were just another ordinary day. I switched off the phone and took a long sip of the bourbon. On the wall in front of me was a photo of us on our 40th wedding anniversary. Jeremiah and I were smiling, holding hands in front of the rose bushes he planted when we moved into this house. They were blooming a vibrant red in that photo. Now, like him, They were withering. Tomorrow, I decided out loud, I'm calling Attorney Owens. Attorney Owens had been our lawyer for over 3 decades. He drafted our will just 2 years ago when everything seemed simple and fair. Half to Kaylin, half to Anaya, with a small portion reserved for Damani, our only grandchild. The house for both of them, to sell or decide between. The mountain cabin for them to enjoy as a family. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen. The very spot where Jeremiah used to make breakfast every Sunday without fail. He always made extra pancakes for the kids, even years after they'd moved out. They rarely showed, only when they needed something. I opened the desk drawer where we kept our important documents. I ran my fingers over the organized envelopes, bills, deeds, insurance policies, until I found the brown folder labeled Last Will and Testament. Inside, the document Jeremiah and I had signed 2 years ago now seemed like a relic from another time. A time when we still believed our children cared about us. A time when duty and love still seemed to be the same thing. I closed the folder and went to our bedroom. Jeremiah's pills were still on the nightstand. The doctor had said it would be fast, but it wasn't. It was 6 months of slow decline, of hospital visits, of hope followed by despair. 6 months during which Kaylin visited 2 times and Ananiah only once, always with ready excuses about work, kids, commitments. When Jeremiah finally passed, it was a regular Tuesday morning. I was holding his hand. He opened his eyes, smiled slightly, and said, "You were always the best part of me, Eliza." And then he was gone. I called the kids immediately. Callan said he'd come for the weekend. Anna promised to take the first available flight. Neither of them followed through. The next morning, I called Attorney Owens. His secretary answered, and hearing my voice, her tone changed. "Miss Hampton, my deepest condolences. We just heard about Mr. Jeremiah." "Thank you, Shonda. I need to schedule an appointment with the attorney. It's urgent. He has an opening tomorrow at 10 a.m. Does that work?" "Perfect." I slept poorly that night, not because of the decision I'd made, but in spite of it. For the first time in weeks, I felt I had a purpose, a clarity. It was as if Jeremiah was by my side, nodding in silent approval. Attorney Owen's office smelled of old books and fresh brewed coffee. He stood up when I entered, his face expressing sincere condolences. "Eliza, it's good to see you. I'm so sorry about Jeremiah. He was an extraordinary man." "Thank you, attorney. He truly was." I sat in the leather chair opposite his desk. "I need to modify our will." He nodded, unsurprised.
Many widows and widowers came through here with the same request. I understand. Are you looking to make specific revisions? I want to remove Kaylin and Ananiah completely. This surprised him. He slowly removed his glasses. Completely. Everything. I want everything. The house, the cabin, the accounts, the investments to go to Damani. Your grandson? Yes. Attorney Owens cleared his throat. Eliza, I know this is a difficult time, but decisions made during grief can be... I buried Jeremiah alone, I interrupted. My voice was calm, but firm. Neither of our children attended the funeral. Anaya was on a yacht celebrating with friends. Kaylin was in a business meeting he could have easily rescheduled. Meanwhile, Damani called every day during his grandfather's illness. He was the one who mowed our lawn when Jeremiah got sick. He was the one who drove me to the hospital on nights when I couldn't drive myself. He's only 22 years old, but he has more character than both his parents combined. Attorney Owens was silent for a moment. I understand, he finally said. We'll prepare the new documents. I should inform you that your children can contest this decision after your passing. They can try, but I want it structured in the safest way possible. A trust for Damani that his parents cannot touch. That can be arranged. He made some notes. Do you want to establish any conditions for Damani's access to the funds? Just that he can't access all of it at once until he turns 30, except for education or medical emergencies. That's sensible for a young man. Attorney Owens nodded. I'll have everything ready for your signature by the end of the week. Leaving the office, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. It was honoring Jeremiah's memory in the only way I had left, ensuring his legacy went to someone who truly valued him. I walked slowly to the car, observing the people on the street. A mother and a little girl passed by, both laughing at some private joke. I didn't feel envy, just a quiet understanding that family ties are more complicated than they look in Christmas photos. That night, for the first time since Jeremiah died, I didn't wear his old sweater to bed.
I lay in our bed, now my bed, and let the silence envelop me. It was no longer a painful silence, but a peaceful one. Jeremiah used to say, "True love doesn't need recognition, but it deserves respect." Our children had forgotten that lesson, but I hadn't. The papers were signed on a cloudy Thursday. Attorney Owens watched me as I passed the pen over the dotted lines with quiet determination. I didn't hesitate once. When you bury your husband alone while your children post selfies with champagne, legal documents stop being intimidating. It's done, Attorney Owens said, gathering the papers. The process will be discreet, but I must warn you. At some point, Kaylin and Anaya will find out. I know, I replied, putting my pen back in my purse. And when they find out, let them hear it from me. Leaving the office, I felt a strange sense of liberation. Not joy or revenge, just a removed weight. The weight of trying to keep an illusion alive. The illusion that my children were still the people Jeremiah and I dreamed they would be. Back home, I opened a closet I hadn't touched in months. Inside were boxes organized by year, each containing checks, bank statements, and receipts. A meticulous accounting not just of money, but of the unilateral generosity that marked my relationship with my children for decades. I pulled out the folder marked Kalan Business and Education. Inside was a collection of expenses that totaled more than what many people earn in a lifetime. The tuition for his MBA at a fancy out-of-state university. The $70,000 for the initial investment in his first business that failed in less than a year. The $10,000 for the down payment on the McMansion he needed to impress clients. The imported car to keep up appearances. With every request, Jeremiah would frown, but eventually give in. He's our son, he'd say. One day he'll learn. That day never came. Anaya's folder was equally revealing. The extravagant wedding that cost the equivalent of a small condo. The renovations on the penthouse she deserved after so much work. The vacations to the Maldives to recover from stress. The private school for her son, which was absolutely necessary for his future. Every request came with the implicit promise of more visits, more calls, more connection. Promises that dissolved as soon as the money was wired. What struck me now, looking at those folders, wasn't the sheer dollar amount, but the pattern. There was never genuine gratitude, just a constant expectation that we would always be there to help. As if our money, earned from decades of hard work and saving, was somehow part of their early inheritance. I closed the folders and put them back in the cabinet, not out of remorse, but to keep them as evidence, not for a court of law,
but for my own heart. The phone rang at 7:32 p.m. that night. Damani's name flashed on the screen. "Grandma, can I stop by tomorrow? I found some books Grandpa would have liked, and, well, I wanted to show you." I felt a lump in my throat. "Of course, baby. Come for lunch." The next day, I made lasagna, Jeremiah's favorite. Damani arrived promptly at noon, carrying a canvas bag of used books and his grandpa's same gentle smile. We ate in the backyard, talking about simple things. He told me about college, his part-time job at a bookstore, his plans for graduate school.
He spoke with enthusiasm, but without the frantic ambition that always characterized his parents. "You know," he said, serving himself more salad, "sometimes I think about how Grandpa approached life. He always said success wasn't about having a lot, but about needing little." I smiled. Those were Jeremiah's exact words. "Your grandfather would be proud of you, Damani." "You really think so?" There was a vulnerability in his voice that reminded me of him as a child, always seeking approval, never demanding it. "I'm sure of it." After lunch, he insisted on doing the dishes. As he dried the plates, he mentioned he was thinking of applying for a research program in African American literature, but he was worried about the cost. "How much is it?" I asked casually. He named a sum that was less than 1/10 of what his father had requested for his latest investment. "Apply," I replied simply. "But Grandma, it's expensive," and I interrupted gently. "Who do you think your grandfather and I saved all our lives for?" He fell silent, polishing an already dry plate. "For moments like this," I continued, "to help people who truly value the opportunity." When he left, carrying the leftover lasagna I insisted he take, I stood at the door, watching his beat-up sedan pull away. The contrast between him and his parents couldn't have been clearer. Anaya called the next day. It was the first time I'd heard her voice since the funeral she hadn't attended. "Mom," her voice sounded irritated. "Damani told me you're paying for his research scholarship?" "No, hello. No, how are you?" Straight to the money. "Good morning to you too, Anaya." "I'm sorry," she said, not sounding truly apologetic. "I'm just worried. You just lost Dad. You shouldn't be making major financial decisions right now." I took a deep breath. "Actually, I've made several important financial decisions recently." "What? What kind of decisions?" The worry in her voice wasn't about me, but about the potential impact on her inheritance. "Why don't you come visit me? We can talk in person." There was a pause. "I'm really busy with work, Mom. You know how it is." "Yes, I know exactly how it is." My voice was quiet. "It was the same reason you couldn't make it to your father's funeral while you were on a yacht with champagne." Silence on the other end. "How did you know?" "Instagram." "Anaya, you posted photos during your father's burial." Another silence, followed by a rushed explanation. "Mom, that was complicated. I was going through a lot emotionally." "And spare me the details," I interrupted. "Come see me if you want to talk. Otherwise, I'll assume you're too busy, as usual." I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking, not from anger, but from relief. Decades of swallowing my words, of looking the other way, of excusing the inexcusable. Finally over. Kalen showed up the next day without warning, as he always did when he wanted something. His imported car pulled into the driveway with that showy flourish that always made me uncomfortable. "Mom," he hugged me briefly. "Are you okay? You look tired." "I'm fine, Kalen. What brings you here?" He looked around as if evaluating the house. "Anaya told me about your conversation. We're worried about you.
Are you? Of course, he said, sitting on the sofa. The same sofa Jeremiah sat on. Losing Dad was hard on all of us. I imagine it was, I replied, though some seem to have handled it better than others.
He had the decency to look ashamed. Look, Mom, about the funeral. I really couldn't cancel that meeting. It was crucial for the business. I know. I sat across from him. The same business for which your father and I gave you $70,000 to start. He blinked, surprised by the direct mention. Normally, I never talked about money like that. That was years ago. Yes, it was. As were the $120,000 for the down payment on your house, and the $45,000 to clear your debts when your first marriage ended, and the... Why are we talking about this now? He interrupted, visibly uneasy. Because your father died, Colin, and I'm taking inventory, not just of our assets, but of our choices. He shifted in his seat. What exactly does that mean? It means I modified our will. You and Anaya have been removed. The shock on his face would be almost comical if it weren't so predictable. Removed? You can't just... I can, and I did. Everything goes to Damani. Damani? His voice went up an octave. My nephew is practically a kid. He's 22. He's a college graduate and has more integrity in his little finger than you've demonstrated in decades. Kalen stood up, his face red. This is unfair. It's the grief talking. You're not thinking straight. On the contrary, I replied calmly. I'm thinking clearly for the first time in years. Your father built everything we have with hard work and principles. Principles you and your sister seem to have forgotten. This is about the funeral, isn't it? I already apologized for that. No, Kaylin. The funeral was just the period at the end of a long sentence. A history of taking without giving, of demanding without thanking, of treating your parents like a bank, not like people who loved you unconditionally. He was quiet for a moment, then tried a different approach. Let's talk about this calmly. Maybe we can come to an agreement, something that... There's no agreement to make. The decision is final. You're gonna regret this, he said, grabbing his keys. Amy and I can contest the will. You can try, I replied. But you'd only be proving my point. He slammed the door shut. Through the window, I watched him immediately reach for his phone, probably calling Anaya. I imagined the frantic conversation, the accusations, the plans to try and reason with me. That night, for the first time since Jeremiah died, I opened a bottle of the good bourbon we saved for special occasions. I poured a glass and took it out to the yard. The roses Jeremiah tended so carefully were starting to wilt with the coming of fall, but there were still a few stubborn blossoms holding on, like me. Looking at the garden, I remembered something Jeremiah used to say. Love is like these roses, Eliza. It needs constant care, regular pruning, and sometimes it needs to face the winter to bloom again. Our winter had arrived, and I was ready to survive it. 3 days passed in a strange silence. No calls from Colin or Anaya, just texts from Damani asking if I needed anything from the supermarket. A calm before the storm, I thought, watering the plants in the backyard. The storm arrived one Thursday in the form of Anaya and her husband Malik pulling into the driveway in their gleaming BMW. She didn't knock. She never knocked. She simply walked in, as if the house were still partially hers. Mom, she said, dropping her designer bag on the entryway table. We need to talk.
Malik stood a few steps behind her, awkward as always. He never truly fit into our family, always checking his phone during Sunday dinners, always with one eye on the door as if looking for an escape. "Good morning to you too, Anaya," I replied, calmly, continuing my watering. "Is it true what Colin told me?" I put the watering can on the ground and turned to face her. My daughter, so physically like me and so different in spirit. Her eyes, the same as mine, were now narrowed with suspicion. "Depends on what he told you. That you disinherited us. That you're giving everything to Damani. This is insane, Mom." I invited her to sit with a gesture. She hesitated, then sat rigidly on the sofa. Malik remained standing, still looking at his phone. "It's not insane, Anaya. It's a consequence." "A consequence of what?" "Of not making it to a funeral." The coldness in her voice struck me like a slap. It wasn't just the absence at the funeral. It was the complete lack of acknowledgement of the gravity of that moment. "You really think it's just the funeral?" She crossed her legs, adjusting her expensive skirt. "What else would it be?" I took a deep breath. "Your father was sick for 6 months, Anaya. 6 months during which you visited once for less than 2 hours before fabricating an office emergency. 6 months when you didn't call to ask how he was. And when he passed, you chose a yacht trip over saying goodbye." "I was processing it in my own way," she defended. "Not everyone deals with grief the same." "That's not dealing with grief. That's ignoring it." She looked at her husband for support, but he was busy responding to emails. "And what about Damani?" she continued. "He barely knew Dad. Why does he deserve everything and we get nothing?" The injustice of that statement was almost comical. "Damani visited your grandfather every single week. He read to your father when his sight started to fail. Damani helped organize the medications. He drove me to the hospital on nights when I couldn't drive. He knew him."
Heniaya. And more importantly, he cared.
"This isn't fair," she said, her voice rising. "We're entitled to that inheritance. It's ours by law."
Actually, it isn't. The assets are mine now, and I can decide who they go to when I pass. Malik finally put his phone away, sensing the rising tension. "Miss Hampton," he intervened, "Ania is just worried about you. Decisions made during grief can be—" "Spare me your feigned concern, Malik," I cut him off. "Neither of you worried about me or Jeremiah, except when you needed money or favors." The silence that followed was thick. Ania seemed genuinely shocked, not by the accusation itself, but because I had finally verbalized it. "How can you say that? We're your family." "Family?" My voice was low but firm. "Family visits. Family calls. Family shows up for the hard times. Not just on holidays and birthdays when there are gifts involved." Ania stood up, her face red. "You're being cruel. Dad would never approve of this." "Your father," I replied calmly, "sat in that chair for 6 months, waiting for his children to come see him one last time." He died disappointed. Don't talk to me about what he would approve of. She snatched up her purse with sharp movements. "This isn't over, Mom. Kalan is already talking to a lawyer. You can't just cut us off like this." Actually, I can. And I did. When they left, I didn't slam the door. I closed it softly, with the same quiet firmness that had sustained me since Jeremiah's death. I returned to the backyard, to my plants. The watering can was still on the ground where I'd left it. I finished watering the azaleas, Jeremiah's favorites, and sat down in the rocking chair. The phone rang inside the house. I let it go to voicemail. Minutes later, it rang again, and then again. On the fourth attempt, I answered. "Hello. Eliza, it's Charles." The voice of our next-door neighbor sounded worried. "Is everything all right? I saw Anaya practically bolt out of your house." Charles and his wife, Lillian, had lived next door for over 30 years. They knew our family better than anyone. "I'm fine, Charles. Just settling some old accounts." "I understand," he said. And by his voice, I knew he really did. Lillian and I were wondering, would you like to come over for dinner tonight? Nothing formal, just some company.
I hesitated. Since Jeremiah's death, I had avoided social gatherings. But suddenly, the idea of sitting with old friends, people who truly knew Jeremiah and me, seemed comforting. "I'd love to, Charles. Thank you." That evening, in the cozy comfort of our neighbor's house, with the smell of home-cooked gumbo in the air, I told them everything. About the solitary funeral, about the decision to change the will, about the confrontations with my children. Lillian held my hand across the table. "You did what you had to do, Eliza. Jeremiah would have understood." "They're my children," I murmured, finally feeling the tears I'd held back for so long. How did we get to this point? Charles, always the practical one, poured more sweet tea. "Sometimes people take paths we can't understand."
You and Jeremiah gave them every opportunity, all the love. What they did with those opportunities was their choice, not yours. Lillian nodded. Some folks don't know how to value what they have until it's too late. And Damani? I asked, thinking of my grandson. Am I doing the right thing? That boy has his head on straight, Charles said. Jeremiah always said so. If only Kaylin and Aniyaya were more like that boy, he used to remark. I returned home feeling lighter, not because of the decision itself. That was already firm, but because I had shared the burden, because I had been heard without judgment. The next morning, a letter arrived. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Kaylin. Not an email, not a text message, but a handwritten letter. This was new. I took it out to the yard with a cup of tea. The envelope was heavy, formal. I opened it slowly. "Mom," it began. After reflecting on our conversation, I realized you might be right about a few things. I wasn't the son I should have been to you and Dad in the last few years. Work, commitments, life, it all seemed to pile up. And without realizing it, I put you both on the back burner. About the funeral, there's no excuse. I should have been there. I should have said goodbye to Dad properly. That's a failure I'll carry forever. As for the will, I understand your disappointment, even though it hurts. Damani is a good kid and deserves recognition. Maybe we can talk about a distribution that acknowledges your concerns but doesn't completely cut off your own children. Please consider it. We are family despite everything. Love, Colin. I reread the letter 3 times. It was conciliatory, almost sincere. Almost. The mention of the distribution revealed the true motive. Not genuine remorse, but negotiation. Still, it was a start. I left the letter on the table without replying. A few words on paper didn't erase decades of neglect, and a single letter didn't undo the image of Jeremiah waiting for visits that never came. Damani showed up that afternoon carrying a toolbox. "Grandma, I noticed the railing on the back porch is loose. Thought I'd fix it for you." I watched him work, his careful movements so reminiscent of Jeremiah's. The way he frowned in concentration, how he measured twice before cutting. "Damani," I said when he finished, "there's something I need to tell you." We sat on the newly repaired porch. I explained the modification to the will.
My decision to leave everything to him. He was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on his own hands. "Grandma," he finally said, "I don't deserve this. I didn't do anything special." "That's exactly why you deserve it. You didn't do anything expecting something in return. You were just present because you cared." "Mom and Uncle Kalen are going to be furious," he muttered. "They already are." He shook his head slowly. "I don't want to be the reason for more family conflict." I took his hands in mine. They were working hands, calloused on the palms, so different from his parents' manicured ones. "Damani, your grandfather built everything we have with honesty and hard work. He valued people who did the same. You are the right person to continue what he started." He nodded, his eyes moist. "I'll try not to let either of you down." "I know you won't." When he left, I stayed sitting on the porch until dusk, gently rocking in the chair Jeremiah built decades ago. The sky turned shades of orange and purple, then deepened. The first stars appeared. "Am I doing the right thing, Jeremiah?" I asked the heavens. The silence that followed felt peaceful, as if the universe itself approved. The following week, I got a call from Attorney Owens. "Eliza, I'm just calling to inform you that Kalen reached out to me." I sighed. What did he want? To know if the will had already been officially filed. When I confirmed that it had, he asked about possible contests. "And what did you tell him?" "The truth, that it's your right to dispose of your assets as you wish, and that the document is legally sound." "Thank you, attorney." "He mentioned he'll try to talk to you again," the lawyer added. "He said he has a compromise proposal." I imagine he does. I hung up the phone and sat down at the kitchen table. The same table where Jeremiah and I had coffee every morning for almost 50 years. Where the children did their homework, where we celebrated birthdays, graduations, and promotions. I picked up a notebook and started writing. Not a will, but a letter, an explanation, something Kalan and Anaya would read after I was no longer here. Not an accusation, but a testimony. "My dear children," I began, "if you are reading this, I am gone. I want you to understand that the decision I made was not out of anger or revenge. I wrote for hours, pouring onto the paper decades of love, disappointment, and finally acceptance. I told them about the dreams Jeremiah and I had for them, about how we watched with growing sadness the distance that time and money created between us, about how in the end, it wasn't the money that mattered, but the presence, the time shared, the small kindnesses that make up a family life, and about how despite everything, I still loved them. Because a mother's love doesn't disappear, even when it's wounded repeatedly. I finished the letter, sealed it, and wrote on the front to be opened after my passing. I put it back in the same drawer where Jeremiah kept his most important documents. The doorbell rang at 10 the next morning. Kalen stood on the threshold, not in his usual business suit, but wearing jeans and a simple shirt.
He looked almost vulnerable. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" I let him in. He looked around as if seeing the house for the first time in years. In a way, perhaps he was. "You changed the curtains," he observed. "Yes, 2 years ago." He nodded, embarrassed. "Can I sit down?" I motioned to the sofa. He sat stiffly, like a visitor, not someone who grew up running through these rooms. "I received your letter," I began.
and I spoke with Attorney Owens. Mom, before you say anything, I want you to know that I understand your disappointment. We weren't the children we should have been. No, you won't. He seemed slightly surprised by my frankness. He expected me to deny, to soften things as I always had. About the will, he continued. I thought of a solution that could work for everyone. A compromise. I'm listening. Anaya and I agree that Damani deserves recognition. He was present when we weren't. So we proposed 50% for Damani, 25% for each of us. I looked at my son, this man
I had cradled, nursed, and taught to walk and talk. This man who was now negotiating percentages as if we were in a board meeting. Colin, I said calmly, this isn't a negotiation. It's not a business deal. It's a decision based on who proved to understand the real value of what your father and I built. But we're your children, he insisted, a hint of frustration in his voice. That has to count for something. It does count. That's why I spent decades helping you two financially, paying for your MBA, for Anaya's mansion, for the cars, for the trips, for the emergencies. You already received your share, Colin, several times over. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. For a moment, I saw something in his eyes. Not anger, but understanding. As if he finally grasped the magnitude of what he had lost. Not the material inheritance, but something far more valuable. I really messed up, didn't I? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He stood up slowly. I'm gonna think about all this, Mom. I gave him a soft goodbye at the door. Brief conversations, sometimes awkward but genuine. Anaya was another story. After our confrontation, she had retreated into a hurt silence. She sent occasional texts about trivial things, but avoided any mention of the will or her father, as if she could erase the reality by pretending it didn't exist. Damani had become a constant presence. He came for Sunday lunch, sometimes bringing books or small gifts, not the expensive, impersonal ones his parents used to give, but things he truly knew I would appreciate. A rare plant for the garden, a handcrafted bookmark, a mug with a quote from a poet Jeremiah and I loved. That specific Sunday, he arrived with a thick folder under his arm. "What's that?" I asked as we prepared lunch together. He smiled, that shy smile that so reminded me of Jeremiah. "A project I wanted to show you before I start." After lunch, he spread papers on the table. Blueprints, drawings, budgets. "Remember we talked about doing something with the house and the cabin?" He pointed to the drawings. "I was thinking of turning the cabin into a small community library."
This neighborhood doesn't have one, and there are so many kids. I examined the detailed plans, the evident care in every detail. And this, he continued, showing another set of drawings, is for the main house eventually. No, not now, of course, he quickly added. But one day, a community center for seniors, a place where people like you can meet, learn new things, share skills. I looked at my grandson, no longer a boy, but a man with vision and compassion. A man who saw property not as status, but as an opportunity to make a difference. "Your grandfather would have loved this," I said, my voice slightly choked. Damani smiled. "Remember how he always said a vacant house is a waste of possibilities?" I remembered perfectly. It was one of Jeremiah's favorite sayings, especially after the kids moved out and the room stood empty. "Damani, these plans are wonderful, but it's going to cost a lot of money." He nodded. "I know, I'm saving up, and I have some friends from college who work in social architecture willing to help with the design. Why don't we start now? I asked. He looked at me surprised.
Now? But you wouldn't need Damani, I interrupted gently. I'm almost 80 years old. I'd rather see these plans become reality while I'm still here to appreciate them. The smile that spread across his face was worth every cent Jeremiah and I had saved throughout our lives. The following week, I took Damani to the bank. We opened a joint account and I transferred enough funds to start the cabin project. Not all the money. I still had enough sense to ensure my own security, but enough for him to launch his dream. The bank manager, a man who had known Jeremiah and me for decades, watched our interaction with a knowing smile. Jeremiah would be proud, he commented as we finalized the documents. Yes, I agreed. He always said money is just a tool. It's how you use it that matters. Leaving the bank, Damani seemed overwhelmed by the responsibility. Grandma, I promise I'll do everything right. Every penny will be used as it should be. I squeezed his arm gently. I know, sweetie. That's why we're doing this. The news reached Colleen and Anaya faster than we expected.
We didn't tell them, but in a small city like ours, secrets have short legs, especially when they involve bank accounts and construction projects. Kaylin called the same night. Mom, I heard you and Damani opened a joint account at the bank. For the first time in years, I felt no need to explain or justify my decisions. Yes, we did. A pause. Can I ask what for? To fund a project. Damani is going to turn the cabin into a community library. Another longer pause. I understand. His voice sounded strangely contained. That's an interesting idea. It was his idea, completely his. Well, if you need help with documentation, permits, anything legal, I'm available. The offer caught me by surprise. Thank you, Kaylin. I'll let Damani know. After hanging up, I stared at the phone for a long time. It wasn't the reaction I expected. Anaya showed up the next morning, without Malik, without the flashy SUV. Just her in a compact, discreet car I didn't even know she owned. Mom, she said, standing at the door. Can we talk? I let her in with a hint of wariness. Our last meeting had not been friendly. She sat down in the kitchen where we always had our most important conversations. She looked different. Less makeup, simpler hair, less extravagant clothes. I heard about Damani, she began. The library at the cabin. I nodded, waiting for the outburst that surely was coming. Instead, she surprised me. I think it's a great idea. You do? She nodded, her eyes fixed on the cup of coffee I had poured her. Dad always talked about doing something like that. Remember? He had that idea of creating a reading space for the neighborhood kids. I remembered. Of course. It was one of Jeremiah's dreams that never materialized, always postponed for after retirement, after the kids finished college, after we have more time. And after that, never came. Damani remembered that. I commented he paid attention when your father spoke. A shadow of sadness crossed Anaya's face. I should have paid more attention too. We were silent for a moment, the clock on the wall ticking away the seconds. I'm getting a divorce, she said abruptly. What? She gave a sad smile.
Ironic, isn't it? After everything you and Dad invested in that extravagant wedding. I didn't know what to say. Anaya and Malik had been together for almost 20 years, though they rarely seemed happy. What happened? She sighed deeply. I realized we built a life based on appearances. Too big a house, too expensive a car, too elaborate parties, and no real substance. She looked me directly in the eyes. Since you changed the will, I've thought a lot about what truly matters, about who truly matters. Mom, you were right. She wiped away a tear. I became exactly the kind of person Dad always criticized. Someone who values things instead of people, who who measures success in acquisitions, not in connections. She paused, and I lost the chance to say goodbye to him. It's never too late to change, Anaya. She smiled wistfully. For some things it is. I can never apologize to Dad, but you can honor what he valued from here on out. That afternoon, I drove her to the cemetery. We stopped in front of Jeremiah's simple grave, now adorned with the red roses I brought weekly.
Anaya knelt, placing her hand on the headstone, as if trying to connect physically with the absent father. I left her alone for a moment, giving her the space she never gave Jeremiah in his final months. From a distance, I watched my daughter, head bowed, shoulders trembling with silent sobs. A belated farewell, but perhaps not too late for her own redemption. On the way back, she asked me about Damani's project. Can I help somehow? I have experience in marketing. I can help with outreach, getting book donations. I'm sure Damani would appreciate that, I replied. Why don't you talk to him? He'll want my help after everything? Damani doesn't hold grudges. In that, he's just like his grandfather. The following Sunday, for the first time in years, I had both my children and my grandson at the same table. The meal started off tense. Colin and Anaya were visibly awkward. Damani was cautiously polite. But as the meal progressed, something began to shift. Colin asked genuinely about the plans for the library. Anaya offered practical suggestions for outreach and fundraising. Damani listened, responded, even laughed at one of Keelan's bad jokes. It wasn't perfect.
Some wounds were too deep to be healed in a single meal, but it was a start. As we were having coffee on the porch, Kellen cleared his throat as he did when he was nervous. Damani, he said, your project with Grandma is an excellent idea, something Grandpa would have loved. Damani looked at him surprised by the unexpected compliment. Thanks, Uncle. If you need help with the legal side, permits, anything, I'm at your disposal, Anaya added. And I can help with the marketing, setting up a website, social media promotion. Damani looked at me confused by this sudden shift. I gave him a small, encouraging smile. That would be great, he finally responded. I'm planning to start the renovation next month. And so, on a warm Sunday afternoon, something small began to grow between my children and my grandson. It wasn't complete forgiveness, not a forgetting of the past, but a quiet acknowledgement of future possibilities. When everyone had left, I sat down again on the porch, looking at the garden Jeremiah and I cultivated for decades.
The roses were fully blooming now, red, vibrant, stubborn in their beauty. Would you see this as a new beginning or just as convenience? I asked the wind, imagining what Jeremiah would say. I could almost hear him answer with that ironic smile he always had for moral dilemmas. Maybe it's both, Eliza, and maybe it doesn't matter as long as everyone grows in the process. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The cabin renovation began on a sunny Monday in April. Damani had assembled a small team, friends from the architecture program, some local volunteers, and surprisingly, Kaylin and Anaya. Kaylin showed up early, wearing jeans and an old shirt, clothes I didn't even know he owned. He brought already approved building permits, saving weeks of bureaucracy. Used a few contacts, he admitted when I asked. It's the least I can do. Anaya arrived soon after, carrying coffee and pastries for everyone. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, without her usual elaborate styling. She also brought a laptop and organized folders. I started the social media outreach, she explained, showing the website she had created for the future Jeremiah Hampton Community Library. We already have pledges for over 500 books. I watched my children working side by side with Damani, Kaylin holding ladders, Anaya organizing volunteers, all following their nephew's directions with a humility they'd never shown before. It wasn't perfect.
There were moments of tension, crossed looks when someone mentioned the past, awkward silences when Jeremiah's name came up naturally in conversation. But there was also something new growing. Respect, perhaps, or at least understanding. At the end of the first day, we all sat on the porch, exhausted but satisfied. Kaylin had dirt on his expensive pants. Anaya had paint in her hair. Damani smiled more openly than I'd seen him smile in years. Grandpa would have loved seeing this, he commented, looking at the cabin structure, where the old windows had been removed to make way for large ones that would let in more natural light. Yeah, he would have, Kaylin agreed, surprising everyone. He always talked about creating spaces where people could grow.
I think I only recently understood what he meant. Anaya nodded silently, looking at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. In the following weeks, a routine was established. Callan came on weekends, bringing materials he got at a discount through his business contacts. Anaya showed up almost daily, coordinating donations, organizing fundraising events, creating community enthusiasm around the project. Damani was the heart of it all, patient, determined, with a clear vision of what the space could become. I watched everything with a mix of emotions. Joy for the project taking shape, pride in the man Damani had become, and a complex melancholy at seeing Colin and Anaya finally demonstrating the qualities Jeremiah and I had always hoped to see in them. Too late for him to witness it. One afternoon, I found Anaya alone in the cabin, organizing children's books that had been donated. "It's a good start," I commented, absorbing the shelves that were starting to fill up. She nodded, running her hand over the colorful books.
"You know what's weird? I'm enjoying this way more than my actual job." "That's not so strange," I replied. "Your father always said doing something for others brings a satisfaction money can't buy." She smiled wistfully. "He told me that so many times. I just wasn't listening." We were silent for a moment. "Mom," she continued hesitantly, "about the will. I understand why you did what you did, and it's okay. Really. Damani deserves it. He was present when we weren't." She carefully arranged a children's book on the shelf. "But I want you to know that I'm not doing this because of the will. I'm not trying to get back into your good graces so you'll change your mind." "I know," I replied softly, and I realized it was true. The money was no longer the central point. Maybe it never had been. It was about recognition, presence, shared values. "Dad would be happy about this," she said, looking around the transforming space, with all of us working together on something that matters. Kaylin had a revelation of his own a few weeks later. He had arrived early one Saturday, bringing materials for the new bookshelves. "I sold the car," he announced casually, as we unloaded lumber.
"Which car?" I asked, knowing exactly which one he meant. "The imported one. The one you and Dad always thought was excessive." I stopped what I was doing. "Why?" He shrugged, but the forced casualness didn't hide the emotion in his eyes. I realized I didn't need it. It was more about impressing other people than any real necessity. He paused. "I used some of the money to invest in a new scholarship fund at the community college in Dad's name." I looked at my son, this man who for so long seemed to have lost track of the values he was raised with, and I saw something of the old Kalon reemerging. The boy who once gave away his entire allowance so a classmate could buy medicine for his sick mother. The teenager who spent afternoons teaching seniors how to use computers. "Your father would be proud," I said simply. Damani seemed the most surprised by his aunts and uncle's gradual transformation. One afternoon, while we were working together in the garden that would circle the library, he voiced his confusion. "Grandma, I don't get it. 6 months ago, they barely came to visit.
Now they're here almost every day, helping, contributing. What changed?" I thought for a moment before answering, my hands busy pulling weeds. "Sometimes people lose their way," I finally replied. They get so busy chasing things they think are important, money, status, power, that they forget what truly matters. And sometimes it takes something drastic to make them realize it, like Grandpa's death and you changing the will. Maybe. Or maybe it's something simpler. Maybe it's seeing you, the next generation, living by different values, showing them another path. He considered that in silence, continuing to dig holes for the flowering shrubs that would border the entrance path. "Do you think I should trust this change?" he asked, finally. "That it's genuine?" I looked at my grandson, so young, yet already possessing the wisdom to question motivations, to seek truths beyond appearances. "Trust, but watch," I advised. "Time reveals the truth of hearts better than any words." 2 months after the renovation began, the Jeremiah Hampton Community Library was almost ready.
The shelves were filled with donated and acquired books, the walls freshly painted in soft tones, the reading tables strategically positioned to take advantage of the natural light. The grand opening was set for a Saturday in June. Anaya had organized everything: invitations to the community, coverage by local media, a small breakfast for the first visitors. On the morning of the opening, I arrived at the cabin early. I wanted a few moments alone in that space before it filled with people and voices. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, creating bright patterns on the restored hardwood floor. The shelves, some of them made from repurposed wood from the original structure, were organized in concentric circles. Damani's idea to create discovery nooks, as he called them. On the main wall, a framed photograph of Jeremiah, taken years ago in his garden. He was smiling at the camera, a gardening tool in one hand, a book in the other. Below it, a simple plaque, in memory of Jeremiah Hampton, who believed books and gardens are places where dreams grow. I felt silent tears stream down my face. How Jeremiah would have loved seeing this. How he would have appreciated every detail, every careful choice. "He is seeing it, you know." Damani's voice surprised me. He had entered silently, wearing a dress shirt and clean pants for the occasion. "In some way, he's here." I nodded, not trusting my voice to reply. Damani stepped closer, putting his arm around my shoulders. "I never could have done this without you, Grandma." "It wasn't me, Damani. It was you, your vision, your work." He smiled, that smile that always reminded me so much of his grandpa. "Grandma, I could only do this because you and Grandpa taught me what truly matters, and because you had the courage to make a tough call when it was necessary." Kaylin and Anaya arrived together, both visibly nervous. Kaylin carried a box of business books for the professional section, not the quick success ones he used to read, but substantial works on business ethics and social responsibility. Anaya brought fresh flowers for the tables and a large leather-bound album.
"It's a guest book," she explained, showing the blank pages to record the history of this place from the beginning. The grand opening exceeded all expectations. Dozens of people from the community showed up. Families with young children, teenagers, seniors. The retired local school librarian offered to train volunteers. A group of teachers proposed an after-school reading program. In the middle of the celebration, I noticed Kaylin talking animatedly with a group of young men about professional mentorship programs. Anaya was organizing a list of volunteers for storytime schedules. Damani circulated through the space, introducing people, connecting interests, creating community. Charles and Lillian, our lifelong neighbors, approached me. "Jeremiah would be beaming," Lillian commented, observing the scene. "Yes, he would," I agreed. "You know what's interesting?" Charles said, discreetly pointing to Kaylin and Anaya. "They look different, more like they did when they were kids." It was true.
There was a lightness about them I hadn't seen in decades, an authenticity that had been buried under layers of ambition and materialism. Sometimes, I replied, we lose sight of what truly matters. And sometimes, thankfully, we find our way back. At the end of the day, when most of the guests had gone, I gathered with my children and my grandson in the small patio behind the library, where Damani had planted a rose garden in honor of his grandpa. Kalen raised a glass of iced tea. He had recently stopped drinking alcohol, another surprising change. To Jeremiah, he proposed, who taught us more than we ever acknowledged. To Jeremiah, we repeated in unison. Returning home that evening, Kalen, Anaya, Damani, and me, there was a different feeling in the air. Not one of complete reconciliation. Some wounds were too deep to fully heal, but one of understanding, of renewed respect. We sat on the porch, as we used to when the kids were little, and life seemed simpler. The night was warm, scented with the aroma of roses and honeysuckles. We talked about trivial things, the weather, the neighbors, plans for the library. Then Kalen cleared his throat, as he always did before saying something important.
Mom, he began, I've thought a lot in the last few months about Dad, about our choices, about the will. I immediately tensed up. Was he finally going back to it after everything we had built? Kalan, I started, but he raised his hand. Please let me finish. It's not what you're thinking. He took a deep breath. I wanted to say that you were right about everything. Anaya and I didn't honor what you and Dad valued. We weren't present when we should have been, and the decision you made was the right one. I looked at my son, unable to hide my surprise. It's true, Anaya added. Damani deserves everything you decided to leave him. He understands the value of what you two built, not just financially, but what it truly means. Damani looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. We don't need to talk about that. Yes, we do, Kalan insisted to clear the air completely. Mom, we want you to know that we respect your decision. We will never contest it. And we are not doing all this, the library, the time we spend here, for the money or for any inheritance.
Or maybe it was no longer necessary. Some truths don't need to be written on paper. They live in actions, in choices, in daily kindnesses. Jeremiah always knew that. And finally, perhaps his children were starting to learn too. Jeremiah's first death anniversary arrived with the fall. The leaves on the trees had that golden hue he admired so much, and the air carried that peculiar mix of melancholy and beauty that October always brings. The community library had become a success beyond our expectations. Kids showed up daily after school. Seniors gathered for book clubs. Teenagers found a quiet space to study. Damani spent most of his free time there, coordinating programs, mentoring volunteers, transforming the initial vision into something alive and vibrant. Kalen and Anaya remained involved, each in their own way. Kalen had established a professional mentorship program for low-income youth, using his business connections. Anai was a facilitator, helping community organizations navigate bureaucracy and find access to funding. Contacts to open doors that would normally remain closed to them. Anaya organized fundraising events, ensuring the library had resources to keep growing. On the morning of the anniversary, I woke up early. The habit of decades with Jeremiah, he always liked to watch the sunrise, remained imprinted on my body. I made a cup of tea and sat on the porch, watching the sky lighten slowly. 1 year, Jeremiah, I murmured into the cool morning air. It feels like so long and so little at the same time. I planned to go to the cemetery alone. I hadn't mentioned the date to the children. I didn't want them to feel obligated to attend. Some journeys need to be made in solitude. But as I was getting ready to leave, the sound of cars parking caught my attention. Through the window, I saw Colin getting out of his car. No longer the flashy imported one, but a simple domestic model. In the car behind him, Anaya and Damani stepped out together, opened the door before they could ring the bell. "We thought you might want company today," Damani explained, holding a bouquet of the same red roses Jeremiah cultivated. I looked at my children, both soberly dressed, both with expressions that revealed a genuine understanding of the significance of this day. "I'd love that," I replied simply. The cemetery was quiet that autumn morning. Dry leaves danced on the ground with the light breeze. We walked together to Jeremiah's grave, a simple headstone, as he would have wanted, with his name and the dates that marked his time in the world. Damani carefully placed the roses. Kalan brought a small stone, which he placed on the headstone, a custom he'd learned in his recent spiritual rediscoveries. Anayaya had brought a book of poetry Jeremiah loved. She opened it and read some verses in a low voice. I stood a little apart, watching my children and my grandson pay their respects to the man who meant so much to each of us, in such different ways. When Anayaya finished reading, Kalan approached the headstone. "Dad," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It took me a long time to understand what you were trying to teach me about what truly matters, about integrity, about presence." He paused, controlling his emotion.
I know it's late to tell you this, but I hope wherever you are, you can see that I'm trying to be better. To be better. Anaya stepped closer. "Daddy?" Her voice trembled slightly. "I miss you so much. I miss your stories, your laugh, your advice, even the advice I pretended to ignore." She smiled through her tears. "Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I seemed to have given up on everything you valued." Damani was last. He didn't speak out loud. He just knelt and remained silent for a long moment, his hand resting on the headstone, as if establishing a physical connection with his grandpa. When he stood up, I noticed he had left something small on the grave, the key to the library. I finally approached. My children and grandson took a few steps back, granting me a moment of privacy. "Jeremiah," I murmured, kneeling with some difficulty. The years were starting to weigh more heavily on my joints. "Look at what happened in your absence. It's not exactly what we expected, is it? Life never is. But maybe it's better this way. Maybe we needed this shock to find our way back." "Love you. I will always love you." When we regrouped to walk back to the cars, Kalan hesitated, then spoke. "Mom, we'd like to do something special today. A kind of celebration of Dad's life. Not something sad, but a recognition of what he meant to all of us." I looked at my son, surprised by the initiative. "What do you have in mind?" "A family dinner," Anaya replied. "At your house, all together. We'd like to cook for you, if you'll let us." The idea of my children, who rarely cooked anything more complex than instant mac and cheese, preparing a dinner in honor of their father, moved me deeply. "Of course," I replied. "Jeremiah would love the idea." That afternoon, my kitchen transformed into a scene I hadn't witnessed in decades. My children working together, awkward, but determined, preparing Jeremiah's favorite dishes. Kalan tried to replicate the special barbecue sauce his father made for the ribs. Anaya struggled with the instructions for the bread pudding Jeremiah adored. Damani coordinated the efforts, keeping everything under relative control. I sat at the kitchen table, watching the organized chaos with a smile. Jeremiah would have loved this. The mess, the occasional laughter when something went wrong, the small victories when something went right.
Dad always said the food didn't need to be perfect, Anayaya commented, looking critically at her slightly lopsided bread pudding. It just needed to be made with love and shared in good company, Kaylin added. When we sat down for dinner, the table set with the best china, the one Jeremiah and I received on our wedding day and rarely used, I felt a completeness I hadn't experienced in a long time. Kaylin poured water for everyone and raised his glass. To Jeremiah Hampton, he proposed, father, grandfather, husband, mentor, man holder up, mentor. The man who taught us the meaning of integrity, even when we weren't listening. To Jeremiah, we responded in unison. The food wasn't perfect. The sauce was a little too salty, the pudding a little soft. But that night, I savored every bite as if it were the most delicious meal I had ever tasted. The conversation flowed naturally, with stories about Jeremiah emerging organically. Memories I hadn't heard in years. Kylan remembering how his father taught him to ride a bike. Anaya recounting the time Jeremiah helped her build a treehouse. Damani sharing memories of the fishing trips they took together. Remember the time Dad decided we all needed to learn to change a tire? Anaya asked, laughing. He deliberately deflated the car tire and made us change it one by one while he timed us. Kylan laughed. I was terrible at it. Took me almost an hour, and he just stood there patiently, without helping, only giving advice when we needed it. Anaya finished. He said practical skills were just as important as any degree. I was surprised to realize we were truly laughing. Not just politely smiling, but genuinely laughing, sharing happy memories instead of mourning the absence. After dessert, Damani nervously cleared his throat. I have something to show all of you. He disappeared briefly, returning with a rectangular package wrapped in simple paper.
It's a project I've been working on, he explained, handing me the package for today. I unwrapped it carefully, revealing a leather-bound book. On the cover, in simple gold lettering, Jeremiah Hampton, A Life of Purpose. I opened it with trembling hands. It was a carefully compiled memoir with old photographs, excerpts from letters, newspaper clippings about Jeremiah's community projects, testimonies from friends, neighbors, and people whose lives he had touched. How did you get all this? I asked, marveling at the richness of the material. Uncle Kaylin helped contact Grandpa's old coworkers. Aunt Anya interviewed neighbors and friends. I just put it all together. I skimmed the pages, absorbing the images of a life well lived. Young Jeremiah smiling next to the beat-up used car we bought with so much sacrifice. Jeremiah with little Kaylin on his shoulders. Jeremiah teaching Anya to plant seeds. Jeremiah and me on our 40th wedding anniversary. And then, reaching the final pages, I found something unexpected. Recent photographs. The community library in various stages of construction. Kaylin mentoring youth in Delton.
Your father would be proud of you right now, I said, holding their hands. And so am I. Later that night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, I sat in the room I had shared with Jeremiah for so long. I took the letter I had written for my children out of the drawer, the one to be opened after my death. I reread it carefully. The words of disappointment, of painful explanation, of love despite everything, were true words when I wrote them. But now they seemed to belong to a different time, to a different version of all of us. I folded the letter and put it back in the drawer. Maybe one day I would rewrite it. Or maybe it was no longer necessary. Some truths don't need to be written on paper. They live in actions, in choices, in daily kindnesses. Jeremiah always knew that. And finally, perhaps his children were starting to learn too. Did you like the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support.
I'm looking
looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.